I'm Mavis Reimer from the Department of English and the new Center for Research in Children's Texts and Cultures here at the University of Winnipeg. It's our very great pleasure to have as a guest today Dr. Rinaldo Walcott from the University of Toronto and the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Dr. Walcott is as well holds the Canada Research Chair in Social Justice and Cultural Studies at the U of T. His research and teaching have been largely in the areas of cultural studies and postcolonial studies, with an emphasis on Black diasporic studies. His current research project is developing a web-based archive of files and short videos that challenge traditional notions of Canadian cultures. It's going to be entitled Other Canadians and the Remaking of the Nation, that is the research project. The database will actually just be called the Other Canadians Database, and he hopes that it will be launched later this year. He has been working with rap music, studying rap music, exploring how it has worked as a social and political force since the early 90s. And that's the topic on which he's going to speak to us today, what rap music has to say. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rinaldo Walcott.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out. This talk kind of begins with rap music as a tease, but I think it kind of veers somewhere else. I want to thank Professor Reimer for inviting me, and it's good to see a bunch of people that I know from elsewhere and stuff like that. I love Winnipeg as a town, so only thing I'm not going to get to see any art this time because it's short and sweet and nasty, but I like this town, so I'm going to go straight to it. Chuck D of Public Enemy once proclaimed that rap music was the CNN of black people. Kanan, Cardinal, and Jellystone, three Toronto-based rappers, recently each offered studied rhymes on black life in Canada, specifically Toronto, in albums of 2005 and 2006. And each of these rappers have at least one track that might be read in light of the emergence of street gang crime in Toronto and the conditions underpinning such circumstances. These rappers in their music offer cogent and politically astute critiques of the social, cultural, and economic conditions that have come to characterize the lives of Canada's black urban poor. In the fashion of rap from the 1980s and early 1990s, these artists provided avenues for understanding, a lament for present conditions, and a refusal of any narrative that merely blames black people, especially black youth, for crime. Can the people at the back hear me? Or you're having a hard time? Okay. I'll try to project. Tell me, but if you can't hear me, tell me so that I know. It cannot hurt too much to continually repeat that black youth and their inventive talents encapsulated in rap music and hip-hop culture had saved the contemporary music business and its ancillary services like conferences and so forth from a total collapse. Thus, despite the turn to largely unimaginative rhymes and beats dressed up with misogyny and homophobia, listening to what rap music has to say should remain a crucial element of popular cultural studies. This is especially so in the case of studying youth and popular culture. The pervasive impact of black youth culture on the contemporary North American landscape might be denied, but it surely cannot be ignored. In this talk today, I want to make three moves. The first, I want to address what rap has to say by turning to Kanan, Cardinal, and Jellystone. Second, I want to address the social, political, and historical context for thinking about black street gang crime in Toronto by turning to earlier scholarship on so-called black deviants. And third, I want to turn to the re-emergence of the contemporary black church and governmental collaboration in these new social and political conditions, which are framing debates on black life in Toronto and Canada more generally. Can you hear?
Yeah, as long as you can project a bit more.
Okay.
Also invite people to go up to the front if they're having trouble, because there's a whole row of seats up there.
Jellystone. Okay. Jellystone sings on his first track from the album, The Hood Is Here. There are two sides to every story, and I want to tell you one. With that segue, he unfolds a history of Reaganomics and trickle-down economic theories with its counterpart, Mulroneyism, that put in place the political and economic conditions for the unfolding of the neoliberal onslaught of the 1990s. The track, Two Sides, makes a case for understanding black poverty and its resulting manifestations in crime and other social maladies, what Cornel West once mistakenly in the USA called black nihilism, as founded in a history of attacks on the poor and the racialized poor. On the track, Jellystone's rhymes mirror the arguments of many activists who have suggested that street gang crime in Toronto was as a result of the Mike Harris neoliberal social, economic, and political conditions which produced an environment of criminalization and thus criminality, a refusal to engage with the powerless and thus a resulting disengagement by them, and a deracination of human dignity through policies that particularly targeted the already poor and disenfranchised. On the other hand, Cardinal on the track, Freshie, from the album Fire and Glory, narrates a tale of how a good boy goes bad. Freshie's mom reunites with him after many years of living in Canada while he lived with his grandmother in Jamaica. His arrival in Canada is a moment for celebration, but that does not last long. With a mother who must work long hours to make ends meet and still can't, and who therefore can't monitor Freshie's friendships, he goes bad. Thus, Freshie winds up dealing drugs and gangbanging. The implications of Cardinal's rhymes are clear, at least sociologically. Freshie is a victim of global economic forces which have intervened in his life at the micro level, producing familial dysfunction, wrapped up in the false hopes of migration north and personal blame for families affected by the restraints of neoliberal global policies. Similarly, on the track EGG, Everybody Gone Gangster, Cardinal laments how the conditions pointedly named in Freshie have produced the effect of a black male masculine hardness called gangster. His lament and critique of such a cultural turn is amplified by Freshie's death in the track discussed earlier. Cardinal's claim that many men claim to be something they are not, a gangster, is an important caution in the sound. Read together, the two tracks document and complete the conditions that have given rise to and simultaneously come to mark poor black communities in Toronto and Canada. If Cardinal recognizes and critiques the internalization and acting out of criminality and gangsterism among young black men, he also offers Freshie as a cautionary tale in his lament. Canaan fine-tunes and globalizes these moments by moving us across to Africa, specifically Somalia. Additionally, Canaan also brings a critique to rap and hip-hop as implicated in the problem itself. Canaan's The Dusty Foot Philosopher offers a track called Who's Hardcore, in which he raps of the violence that he witnessed firsthand in war-torn Somalia. Notions of hardcore, meaning hard and bad, have come to mark much of contemporary rap music's discourse, making violence a central conceit of the music. By turning to Somalia, Canaan ups the ante of the hardcore discourse of rap while simultaneously offering a critique of war, suggesting that rap has lost its way with violence, metaphorically and actually. He balances his critique in Who's Hardcore with the track If Rap Gets Jealous, in which he calls on rap and hip-hop culture to mature or grow up and move beyond the poetics of violence and crime to produce forms of community that might counteract the macro-violence of racism and imperialism, which helps to produce the micro-violence of street gang crime. Canaan was recently nominated and shortlisted for Canada's richest music prize, the Polaris. His album is an intricate mix of intelligent rhymes scanning the Americas and Africa, connecting and disconnecting as he engages contemporary black global life. Each of the rappers are acutely aware that their rhymes reference the global conditions of black people, especially poor black people. What this music reveals is that contemporary black Canadian musicians are offering an analysis and dialogue alongside those that activists, some scholars, and some socially progressive politicians are offering as well. These musicians echo what Zygmunt Bauman has recently termed wasted lives. While Bauman is concerned is concerned to assess wasted lives in terms of environmental waste, he is also interested in the conditions which have produced wasted lives for migrants, refugees, and other outcasts. In this particular historical moment, the people that the rappers speak for and with constitute the outcasts. Bauman reads globalization as producing various kinds of waste, chief among them, wasted humans. To read street gang crime in this sense is to offer a different kind of analysis than merely one of law and order. It is to ask questions of how human waste is being produced in Canada as it participates as one node in this global circuit of transnational late capitalism. Over 100 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois published The Philadelphia Negro, a social study, a comprehensive study of African American social and cultural life in an American city, Philadelphia. In that study, which Elijah Anderson, commemorating its 100th, the 100th year of its publication, describes as no mere museum piece, Du Bois identified and offered an analysis of the conditions that gave rise to what has now emerged as successive generations of working poor and endemic poverty among African Americans. The brilliance of Du Bois' analysis in this study was the ways in which his analysis spoke to and continues to point to the conditions of economic rationality which produce particular kinds of social and cultural effects for African Americans. We now call that rationality neoliberalism. Du Bois' The Philadelphia Negro still offers a useful counterpoint to texts and theories like William Julius Wilson's On the Class Theory, as well as culture of poverty theories. What Du Bois offered was a critique of capitalism and its racialization, which produced a black excess and or surplus that became one that had to be socially controlled by authorities. But such bodies are now rendered as waste. Similarly, in 1978, Stuart Hall, Chas Critter, Tony Jefferson, John Clark, and Brian Roberts published the still relevant and groundbreaking Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order, in which they demonstrated across a range of nation-state apparatus the invention of mugging as a state technique of control of unruly and undesirable bodies, mainly those raised as non-white or black in the UK context. In Hall, The Social History of a Moral Panic, as they called it, they offered us a methodology for making sense of moral panics, how, quote, events are produced, perceived, classified, explained, and responded to, end quote. By so doing, they point to how moral panics are used both discursively and in regards to state policy to police and control, once again the excess or surplus labor of neoliberal capitalist arrangements. I have turned to Du Bois and Hall as a backdrop for thinking about race and crime in Canada, specifically blackness and crime in Toronto, because I think their insights help us to explore differently what might be at stake in various responses and analyses of the first generation of street gang crime among Canada's and Toronto's black diasporic youth populations. In what follows, I try to work across a fairly wide terrain to offer an interpretation that makes the nation-state present as a unit of analysis, as well as to reanimate conversations about diaspora identifications, migrant subjectivities, and what I have called the ethno-political, to reappear in our conversations, I hope forcefully, as units of analysis pushing towards a more ethical future. The bombings in England of July 2005, the riots in France of October 2005, and the last 5 years of intensified gun violence in Canada all share similar roots if read through the lens of a politically inflected diaspora analysis. At the center of such an analysis must be an appreciation, understanding, and acknowledgement of persistent racisms, xenophobia, and the production of migrant subjectivities in the Western metropolis. In the case of the latter, that is, migrant subjectivities, its production is simultaneously one of agency and one of exclusion. By this I mean that many of the young people that concern my analysis here cannot be considered migrants by any stretch of the imagination, because they have either migrated at such a young age that memories and or pertinent engagements with another homeland is tenuous, or they are second and third generation children of migrants born in the West. However, they are produced and have experienced life within a context of having to negotiate a here and a there, both in the public and private realm, for which their only reference point is the production of producing their here. In this way, they have an experience and engagement with migration even when they themselves have not migrated. Such is a migrant subjectivity. This migrant subjectivity constitutes a significant critique of nation-state inadequacies. It can be a nostalgic longing, or it can be a perverse and disturbing anthropologization of an imagined homeland culture, always somewhere outside of the metropolitan place. Let me focus on one strand here: estrangement from the nation. Two recent articles in the Canadian popular public sphere might focus our attention. In the Literary Review of Canada, historian Michael Bliss writes of Canada as a failed nation. And in the Walrus, pollster Alan Gregg writes of Canada's identity crisis. Both of these articles constitute a significant acknowledgement of contemporary anxiety concerning Canada's racialized others. Bliss accuses that, quote, the assertions of ethnic minorities to the effect that Canada should have no official culture, end quote, has fueled the failure of the nation. This assertion by ethnic minorities, in his view, radically affects Canada's foreign policy, and in fact he cautions that, quote, in the global struggle against Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, Canada, where the Muslim population outnumbers and is growing faster than the Jewish population, fares uncertainly, end quote. Similarly, Gregg offers us a picture of immigrant enclaves with little or no exchange between a host community and a second generation that refuses to be integrated into a mainstream Canada, as was once the case in the past. He then asks a question in the conclusion of his essay, his article, quote, the events of the last year have presented the West with a conundrum. Can liberal democracies, lacking a unifying ethos, satisfy the needs of societies that are increasingly heterogeneous? The question, situated as it is in the last paragraph, is a curious rhetorical move by Gregg, since the entire article had already suggested no was the answer. So my questions are, how are Western metropolises responding to these conditions, especially at the local level? How do we make sense of and assess metropolitan crime? That is, how might we resignify crime as the state practices of brutal forms of explicit and implicit coercive state power brought to bear on racialized others? The question of violence, and in particular terrorism, has become a dominant trope and reality for racialized bodies in this era of what I call global cowboyism. In a recent edition of the Chief on City TV, and this is the local, this paper unfortunately is going to move between kind of national, local, and other contexts. In a recent edition of the Chief on City TV, Inspector Detective Greg Getty referred to gang street crime as, quote, urban terrorism. For him, that was its proper name. Such an assessment of the situation means a number of things in our times. Black people remain aberrant, less than human, and in need of constant policing, surveillance, and control. In effect, a war must be waged on them. But all of this is not new for anyone who has been a careful attendant to the histories of black peoples in North America, and in fact what we call the West. In Canada and Toronto, we need to make sense of this new phenomena of crime, surveillance, and control as located within at least a 25-year time span in which the anxieties about the increasing numbers of black peoples in the city of Toronto has played itself out in various ways. If we turned to the police shootings of the late 1970s and 1980s and early 1990s, and then the revelations of racial profiling in the 2000s, and now the inward turn of violence as it unleashed itself on the working poor and poor in our communities, we can trace a very specific kind of social control and political and cultural disenfranchisement of the affected communities. In 1992, when the Young Street riots occurred, and young black people said that they felt treated no differently from the ways in which police treated African American urban areas, they were rebuffed for making such claims. Canadians, by and large, disapproved of such sentiments and claimed a difference on matters of race and racism from the U.S. But Stephen Lewis's report of 1992 pinpointed what he called anti-black racism as a central feature of the lives of young black people in the city of Toronto, and we can extend it across the country. More recently, the Toronto Star's reports on racial profiling from October the 19th to the 27th, 2002, statistically confirmed that there was indeed something that we might call anti-black racism. The North American history of anti-black racism, taken along with two terms of Reaganomics, Thatcherism in Britain and in our country, Mulroneyism, a term by Bush Sr., and then what seemed like a relentless liberal onslaught in the midst of provincial neoliberalism of all sorts, characterized by the Mike Harris neocon juggernaut in Ontario of the 1990s, created the conditions that have led to this flare-up of violence as a condition of severe poverty and other forms of social and cultural disenfranchisement. As stated earlier, rappers have enumerated this history in their music as a way of communicating with their publics. The wealthy has benefited as government stealing from the poor and the working poor have disposed of those who cannot do for themselves, as wealth is transferred from those without it. As wealth is transferred, and those without it are criminalized and dehumanized in all kinds of ways. The 2001 Canadian census suggests that 50% of black Canadians live on or below the national poverty line. It is in fact these kinds of social and economic conditions that give rise to the kinds of violent phenomena that we're witnessing and that Du Bois, the Philadelphia Negro, can help us to make sense of in our times. For instance, this past summer, when the Toronto Metropolitan Police raided numerous homes in the Jamestown neighborhood, and Jamestown neighborhood is one of the affected neighborhoods in relationship to street gang crime and other forms of social decay. And they raided on the basis of alleged search for the Jamestown Crips. So if you know anything about the urban street gang crime in the U.S. context, you notice certain kinds of migrations of language and naming and so forth. A war was declared on the black, poor, and working poor in the city of Toronto. This war targets all those who are youthful, phenotypically black, and those who are black identified, or what we might call black tainted, that is, tainted in terms of forms of dress, attitude, and other markers of popular culture, specifically hip-hop culture. I would argue that the raid on Jamestown was in fact the first salvo in the enactment of a local and national law and order agenda and enforcement that inaugurates the extension of discourses of security from the global discourses of terror to the local and enacted on populations marked as excess and waste within the state, and for which legislative power must be exercised upon to render such persons less than citizen. This is a particular exercise of the law that is meant to re-signify citizenship for the alleged accused as a gift and not a given. But significantly, these are the populations of wasted human life that the ruling class must constantly make disappear. Prisons have been central in this disappearing act. Those raids confirm that working poor and disenfranchised racialized others are rendered non-citizen through juridical techniques meant to institute law without a recourse to law, which is to glibly gloss Giorgio Agamben writing in the States of Exception about the ways in which the camp makes use of a law for which people who are in the camp have no access to law, but they're brought there through a language of law and the juridical. And similar kinds of things are happening at the local level in relationship to the policing of so-called street gang crime. Stuart Hall and Cash-Chitter et al. Demonstrate that the law and order state must come into being when national crises, characterized by crises in capital alongside national narratives, begin to disintegrate, making both racialized and working class people criminal, and in this moment, making them also waste. They point to a language of conspiracy by the state, a language being used by all levels of government in Canada to act as one of the recourses to the law and to the law and order juridical. In this case, we are told that street gangs are conspiring to destroy our communities and our way of life. Does this sound familiar? We hear the same in the War on Terror discourse, a conspiracy to destroy our way of life. And in such a case, we have to give the state extraordinary powers to discipline all those who are in any way accused or come into contact with the conspirators who will destroy our way of life. In this regard, also, extra-state organizations also come to play crucial roles in this policing, in this security era. In Du Bois's Philadelphia Negro, an entire chapter is devoted to the black church called The Organized Lives of Negroes. While Du Bois is generally supportive of the role the church plays, he is somewhat cautious as well. He wrote of the Negro church, and it's really interesting to go back and read Du Bois, The Philadelphia Negro, because when he wrote that study that he was commissioned to write by liberal white folk in the city of Philadelphia who wanted to make sense of the social decay that had developed among black people within that city, he actually had a falling out with his benefactors who funded the study because they thought that somehow he was a bit too lenient in his assessment of the situation. But reading that study 100 years after, you begin to see all kinds of hesitations on Du Bois's part in that study. And his writing around the black church is one of them. So let me quote you something that he writes in the opening of that chapter. He says, "We often forget that the rise of a church organization among Negroes was a curious phenomenon. It was natural that any movement among freedmen should center about their religious life, the sole remaining element of their former tribal system. Consequently, when, led by two strong men, they left the white Methodist Church, and I stress this part, they were naturally unable to form any democratic moral reform association. They must be led and guided, and this guidance must have the religious sanction that tribal government always has." In Du Bois's words are a caution or hesitation that in the post-civil rights era comes to most forcefully mark the black church, its patriarchal authoritarianism. The black church has produced these qualities across numerous black global spaces as it attempts to hold on to its historical role as an important site of black resistance to racial oppression. The Canadian case is no different. From the 1970s to the 1990s, it was improper for black Canadians to claim to share an identity with African American racial oppression. But by 2006, it made sense for the Canadian political class, through its proxy, the GTA Faith Alliance, which is the Greater Toronto Area Faith Alliance, to turn to African American experience to combat homemade Canadian crime. How can or should we make sense of this shift? So let me take a detour to the black church, or let's call it what they're calling it now, both here in Canada and in the US, the faith community. I don't know if anybody read not this month's Walrus, but last month's Walrus, to see the big piece that's also been done on the ways in which quote unquote, the faith communities, the right-wing faith communities, are making particular kinds of coalitions and setting up all kinds of so-called research foundations in Ottawa to influence particular public and social policy. So the church is making a quite serious return to the political sphere, and it's one that we need to be fully aware of because it's working through particular marked communities to make that return. The New Names signals a lot. The New Names history is one of a religious Big C conservative alliance, an alliance that is anti-feminist, homophobic, and hostile to many of the open ends that the post-civil rights movement offers. In particular, in the post-civil rights era, the black church's assumed leadership role has come under tremendous stress, scrutiny, and in some cases, it has been rendered absolutely illegitimate. For instance, in the discourse around HIV/AIDS in the African-American context, the black church has been rendered absolutely illegitimate. In fact, it's been demonstrated that the black church basically kept its mouth silent on HIV/AIDS from the mid-'80s well into the mid-1990s. There's no doubt that the post-civil rights era has ushered in a diminishment of the political reach of something called the black church across North America. This decline in political reach is a complex one and can't be summarized in the time that I have here today. Therefore, I want to point to one or two general claims about its decline that might help us to situate the black church now. The black church in the U.S. context aided in helping to usher in a black middle class in the civil rights era, who, like all middle classes, sought to separate themselves from the working poor and the poor around them. Thus, a once imagined, and I stress imagined, and perceived black community became fractured politically, socially, and culturally. But what the black middle class was able to continue to do is to broker power, or at least authority within governmental spaces on behalf of an imagined national black community. A national black community that usually translated into middle class desires, interests, and concerns. So let me be clear, the black church got its power from the deep and historical disenfranchisement of African Americans from U.S. nation-state formation, in particular its governmental apparatus, which was put in place shortly after the Reconstruction period of the Civil War in the 1860s, and in particular reached its nadir in the 1880s, when African Americans were really pushed out of the U.S. political public sphere. The black church thus filled a void that was as much civic as it was religious. As has been well documented in the U.S. context, the black church only became a central force in the U.S. civil rights movement because there was no other organization well enough populated and mobilized to reach the necessary demographic to provide various communities, to provoke various communities in acts of resistance. The church's position arose out of political necessity and not out of some kind of preordained and predestined order. Its moment has now passed, but the church, like many other mighty institutions, struggles to reclaim its lost power. The black church's contemporary legitimacy as a political force then has largely been spent, no pen impounded, but the once laudable Jesse Jackson is now a disgraced reverend who had to own up to a love child. If we take Jackson as a symbol of the black church's political reach, then we can see how the public sphere decline of the black church in the U.S. has occurred. But there's also a wrinkle to this story, and that wrinkle is George Bush. Mr. Bush's faith-led government has opened up an important space for the black church and more broadly other Christian denominations and other acceptable religious organizations to enter the political public sphere again, and thus to enter secular life through the back door by tying social and public policy decisions to faith communities. These faith communities have become the sites of distributions for important funds like HIV/AIDS education and sexual education, community social programs, and other programs necessary for ameliorating the sometimes dire conditions of social and cultural life for the poor and working poor in the urban areas in the U.S. Thus, the Bush administration has put in place a program to teach religious values through community programs and the dispensation of important information, especially on sex and sexuality. The language and the policies of faith-based programs have consequences, It helps to further cement the economic impact of the neoconservative triumph of the last 25 years. It helps to put in place the continued surveillance and control of the urban poor, a project that has been with us since human beings invented cities. And it aims to convince those among us who have been rendered obsolete by global capitalism that it is our fault and not that of the radical remaking of the welfare state. A state that even within the confines of capitalism was willing to tacitly acknowledge that a good society looks after those who cannot adequately look after themselves. Faith-based programs work to put in place the cultural side of the neoliberal economic program, I would argue. These programs are fundamentally concerned with control, the control of conduct and the governance of the self, so that those in authority never forcefully challenge the ruling regime. In the Toronto case, the GTA, I'm going to talk you through this, the GTA Faith Alliance has begun to collaborate with the government, and the Ontario government is calling this a new political move. They see this as somehow radically different from engaging with the various kinds of provincial NGOs who usually fill that space. And so this kind of turned to the black church within the realm of social and political public policy is very interesting and new within this context. And it speaks to, in some ways, from my perspective, a particular kind of troubling source, because on the one hand, it is a reaching across the border to import a particular kind of U.S. and African American historical conversation and collaboration, while not recognizing that that collaboration has actually collapsed and is now beginning to resurface within the context of the two-term presidency of George Bush because of the language of faith-based politics and alliances within the U.S. context. We're now importing that as a way to talk about and to address street gang crime and social maladies within the Ontario, Toronto, and Canadian context. So there's a very interesting contradiction. If in the 1990s black people were rebuffed for identifying with African American racial oppression, by the time we get to 2000, governmental collaboration and faith-based collaboration can turn to that same context as a way of controlling the excess and the waste that the neoliberal project has produced. So I'm going to turn to the final part of this paper. There is a DVD that has circulated within Toronto hip-hop circles called the Real Toronto DVD. And it's a DVD that the Metropolitan Toronto Police has actually used as a source to arrest so-called gang members. So I'm going to do a bit of a discussion of that, and then I'm going to move towards a conclusion. So in the final part of this paper, I want to spend a short time on the Real Toronto DVD. This DVD has been used twice now by the police to arrest so-called gang members, and more recently as evidence in the raid on Jamestown, the community that I mentioned earlier. The Real Toronto DVD is in itself an interesting document of the issues I have been trying to pinpoint. The DVD is a disturbing mix of masculine bravado and desires for a hip-hop musical star life. Most of the young men in the video seem to desire to be rappers, and many of them perform for the camera a specific discourse of hip-hop and masculinity that concerns itself with hip-hop's credibility being embedded in the street and in toughness, in hardness. This particular discourse thus circumscribes what the young men can and will say to the camera. Indeed, some of the men in the Real Toronto DVD represent and perform, in quotation marks, a nihilistic response to the social and cultural conditions of their lives. Some brandish weapons and make statements that suggest a deep and frightening interpretation of the world they inhabit. These particular young men, only one woman appears in the Real Toronto, seem to represent the most extreme form of alienation and disenfranchisement from Canadian society. But what is most interesting is that isolating them out from the larger context of the DVD makes them even scarier, as has been done by the mainstream media, which in Toronto, at least on the local news, and I know it was carried on parts of the national news on News World, They've isolated parts of this DVD and showcase young men brandishing guns and shooting in the air and so forth and whatnot. The Real Toronto moves across at least 5 different neighborhoods, interviewing young men and showcasing the dire social and cyclical decay and physical decay of the infrastructure of the communities these men inhabit. The DVD interviewees offer analyses of their communities and the decay, alongside evidence of community projects to combat decay where possible by rebuilding basketball courts and such by community members. The Real Toronto offers a blunt assessment of the neoliberal decimation of poor and working poor and black neighborhoods. It is curious that none of the media reports have produced any discourse around this aspect of the DVD. So for instance, there's scene after scene in this DVD of some of these young men taking the people who interview them to padlock community centers, to basketball courts that have not had a keep for 7, 8, 9 years, and then to other basketball courts where the community got together and repaired them and so forth. In none of the coverage of the DVD has there been any kind of mention of this kind of thing happening in it. What's repeatedly been shown is the young men who are shooting guns off into the air. Taken together, the nihilism of the DVD, the critique of social decay, and the always lurking criminalization of youth in these communities, some of the young men in the DVD say that from the age of 12 and 13, the police who patrol their neighborhoods are already taking their names and addresses. So by the time they turn 16 and 18, they already are embedded into the criminal justice system in particular kinds of ways. The Real Toronto DVD offers a critique and assessment that returns issues of class, nation, labor, race, and state practices to the table. That the DVD has only been used as a tool of state repression should give us pause, since it documents a much larger ethical imperative of our citizenship. Since the Jane Krieber murder at the end of 2005, the beginning of 2006, the 3 levels of government have been cashing in on its aftermath. One way that the cash-in has worked has been to articulate a law and order agenda on behalf of an imagined silent majority living in a realm of danger, fear, and constant lurking threats. Such conditions allow for the kinds of operations enacted on Jamestown, where in the short term, some residents applauded the police actions. But such actions also signal the terms of citizenship within the neoliberal order, and return us to a series of overlapping colonialisms in which race and nation appear to be synchronized in a world where multicultural and cosmopolitan presences point towards a Creole future to come. So there's a real contradiction here where these people are being read outside the nation when actually other discourses of the nation produce forms and languages of cosmopolitanism and global citizenship and multiculturalism in which these people would make absolute perfect sense. In this context, Canada has been repeatedly rated as one of the top 10 Western countries to live in, but persistent poverty among Canada's Black and Aboriginal First Nation peoples tells a different story of that top rating. As Hall and Critter and others and Du Bois point out, in such cases, social control and authoritarian measures become at least one way to blunt the force of such capitalist contradictions alongside programs of moral regulation. In this regard, the racialized poor find themselves the victims of a vulgar and old colonialism alongside a new colonial paradigm in which race and class overlap at the site of economics in regards to poor and working poor people, but becomes something different altogether as we move up the class ladder. And this is why in this paper, in this talk, I'm being really careful to say I'm talking about poor people, working poor people, and poor Black people, because I think that a lot of the ways in which some of these discourses are working, that middle class people of color actually live outside of them. We're not affected by them in certain kinds of ways because we have particular kinds of access and language to some of the more legitimate institutions. Lost where I was. Okay. New and old colonialisms allow us to think how state power positions raciology as an important operation of the still quite sturdy narratives of nation and belonging. What Hall et al. Call the social history of social reaction is crucial to the policing of Black youth here. And let me quote them at length. They write, schematically, it begins with, this is the social history of social reaction. Schematically, it begins with the unresolved ambiguities and contradictions of affluence. It is experienced first as a diffuse social unease, as an unnaturally accelerated pace of social change, an unhinging of stable patterns, moral points of reference. It manifests itself as an unlocated surge of social anxiety on the hedonistic culture of youth, on the disappearance of the traditional insignia of class. Later, it appears to focus on more tangible targets, specifically on the antisocial nature of youth movements, on the threat to British life by the black immigrant, and on the rising fever chart of crime. I think that all of this assessment, Hall and his buddies did this in 1978, before the predominant language of security, danger, and threat has now come to make these kinds of assessments a part of everyday political language. But it's exactly at the place of nation and belonging that diaspora, and in particular its second and third generations, pose a problem for the nation state. As Gilroy points out, and I quote, when a diaspora talks back to a nation state, it initiates conflict between those who agree that they are more or less what they were, but cannot agree whether the more or less should take precedence in contemporary political and historical calculations. End quote. This is exactly the case for those black second and third generation youth whose presence in this country now disturb and make apparent the lie of blackness as only migrant to the nation. But significantly, these same youth produce a national anxiety that renders the disappearance from national consciousness of a much longer black presence apparent. Taken together, second and third generation black poor and working poor youth force us in a number of different ways to account for the exclusive machinations of nation-state citizenship, or its wasted lives. Finally, I would argue that the strict parameters of citizenship in the modern West is a metropolitan crime that has been increasingly sealed within a racial contract with racialized elites who collude in the moral regulation of the poor and working poor. Ideas of multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, conviviality, and Creoleness all offer us ways to think conceptually and practically about how we might all live together. And while I myself am committed to working with many of the promises of such concepts, none of them currently offer us ways to think about the twinning of race and working classness properly, I would argue. Thus, I want to argue for ethno-politicality when class has become so deeply racialized. We need to bring the language of ethnicity back to the table. I know that many of us working in progressive sites within cultural studies and so forth have become tainted or disillusioned by using the language of ethnicity. But I want to argue that part of what we see happening within the context of crime, or whether we're looking at terrorism, is ethnically inflected. And therefore, we need to figure out a way to talk about ethnicity again. A potent way to talk about ethnicity again that brings politics back to the table in ways that we can sustain that conversation and offer counter responses to what I would suggest has been already put into play by others. If we could uncouple citizenship from nation and identity and sameness and recast it as responsibility to the other and the self, we might begin to approach the practice of living together differently. Responsibility to the other is also particular care of the self that requires different techniques of living a life, not known in advance of what it could be. The striking importance of the Real Toronto DVD is that its interviewees know their futures and know them to be no different from their present. Thus, both Bliss and Gregg could learn something about the failure of the nation state and its projects of inclusion by carefully spending time viewing the Real Toronto and listening to the residents of Jamestown describe the conditions under which they experience Canada. So what is at stake? There is evidence in the U.S. context that the faith-based programs have been working hard to teach young men how to be good little patriarchs in homes, and that many of these programs foster a tacit, if not outright homophobic attitude. I should have kind of said something before I say that, which is that the Bush government redirected lots of social spending through faith-based programs. And there's now been a number of US-based NGOs have been doing studies at what these programs have been doing and what they've been trying, how they've been trying to, what kinds of young men they've been producing. Because interestingly enough, these programs have focused on young men. And what these programs have been trying to do is they've been actually trying to produce young men as good little patriarchs. And it's really interesting to see what the ways in which they're trying to do that. And I suspect that similarly we will see something like that happening within the Canadian context. Despite the many social projects and programs announced recently by the province of Ontario and the city of Toronto's ongoing projects to involve a larger slice of the citizenry in taking responsibility for the deeper social malaise that have produced this first generation of violence, much remains piecemeal and short-sighted in these areas. Last winter, the province announced with much fanfare what they call the Youth Challenge Fund and named Michael Pinball Clemens, the Argonauts coach, its chairperson. The fund targets 13 communities suffering from the effects of violence. Even more recently, the province announced, this past summer actually, the province announced $3 million to faith-based groups to run a series of programs in similar communities. The latter has been touted, as I said earlier, as a new approach to social problems. And finally, small amounts of money have been made available to ongoing NGOs that have been working around these issues for a very long time. What is not clear remains to be seen, but what is somewhat predictable given the route the province has taken with the Youth Challenge Fund and the faith-based funding, is that this type of social engineering is most likely to fail in the long term, even though producing seductive effects in the short term. The churches will attract the youth who were already there along with a few others. The terms of the Challenge Fund offer a promise that requires far more than the terms of the fund would allow it to do. The fund suggests that communities can apply to this fund to re-energize their neighborhoods. But we all know from the tremendous amount of research that has been done in the US context that communities cannot be revitalized if there are no legitimate services in those communities, if there's no forms of employment in those communities and so forth and whatnot. And the fund is only a $13 million fund, so it can't provide all of those kinds of things. In this case, such a fund also needs strong and insightful government commitments to real sustained investment in communities and people, their infrastructure, economic, cultural, and social lives. To date, not one level of government has seriously offered any kind of assessment of how to bring deeply alienated and excluded citizens into some notion of a Canadian public sphere. It is that real alienation and disenfranchisement that is so disturbingly present in the Real Toronto DVD. Just let me say one last thing and then I'll stop. One of the things that's clear is that sports-inspired and faith-based programs have failed in the US situation. And they're destined to fail in the Canadian situation as well. Kanan's album, The Dustyfoot Philosopher, speaks directly to violence in Black people's lives in Toronto, Africa, and across the globe. In particular, the track that I mentioned earlier, If Rap Gets Jealous, is a gritty accounting of violence in rap music and violence in the larger world, and the desire to escape both kinds of violence. In Kanan's analysis and critique of the violence, he offers the refrains in the track, If Rap Gets Jealous, that he'd rather be on stage. His refrain calls to mind for me the central role that engaging young people in creative cultural expression can hold for all kinds of social, cultural, and political contexts, that have given rise to some of the underlying issues that have led to a mushrooming of gun violence in many of Toronto's urban, working class, poor, and multiracial communities in the last 10 years. Thank you for your time and your patience. That's generous.
Maybe I'll do both at the same time. I'll come forward and ask the question. First of all, your talk was great. I really
Thank
got
you.
so much out of it. My mind is sort of buzzing. I'm particularly interested in your three moves, and in my mind I'm trying to sort of fit them together. And I'm interested to what extent, I mean, your critique of the black church and its sort of leadership role in providing a sort of homophobic, patriarchal model. And I'm sort of wondering if you're seeing rap and hip hop as being able to confront that more directly, or being sort of another venue where a different type of leadership and organization can take place. I mean, you did, when you're talking about the OISE analysis, if I'm right, there was some notion of the need for leadership, and the reason why the black church rose up in the first place was this need for leadership. And so I'm sort of interested in to what extent you see those possibilities within rap and hip hop, and I suppose the flip side of that is also, you know, that non-progressive rap and hip hop stuff that also comes out and sells the most records and is the most common association, and what's going on with those relationships.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. It'll give me the chance to also kind of use some of the other stuff that's kind of like footnotes to this paper, but are crucially informing what I'm trying to do. And it's a work in progress, so some of those things may actually come into the body of the text at a later date. But one of the reasons that I wanted to find a way to talk about rap, what I see as the decline of the black church's legitimacy, and these questions of social decays, because part of the conversation that has happened in Toronto, in late 2005 and early 2006 was that, in fact, rap music and hip hop culture was part of the problem, and subsequent to that, Eugene Rivers, who's an African American preacher from Boston, was brought to Toronto by the GTA Faith Alliance to meet with the mayor and other interested parties. And in that round of meetings, two things emerged. One was a quite sustained attack on single black mothers and an attack on black youth culture. And so, you know, clearly what sells within hip-hop in this particular moment is deeply fraught with a set of contradictions around misogyny, homophobia, and so forth. But there are also other things happening. And in fact, the people who sell the most rap records in the Canadian context can't be so closely tied to the African-American production of misogyny and homophobia in hip-hop. So Cardinal remains a fairly significant seller, and he's one of the people I'm citing here. Kanan was just nominated for the Polaris Prize as a recognition of his creativity in relationship to the work that he's done, and the album is actually a quite stunningly intelligent album. And Jellystone, who varies across a number of kinds of things, but even, you know, the first couple of tracks on that album is an attempt to think seriously about these social conditions. And in some ways, he even pushes it on his track further than some of the activists. So many of the activists stopped in the 1990s with Mike Harris and so forth. He goes back to Reaganomics, Mulroneyism as a way of trying to make sense for the generative production of how we arrive where we are. at 2006. But if rap generally is understood to have a whole series of contradictions within it, the black church has the same thing. Jesse Jackson and other preachers, and even the white Baptist church, as we saw recently in the U.S. midterm elections, right? The contradictions around sex proliferate in those spaces as well. So part of what I'm trying to do is to kind of, right now at this moment, kind of glibly point to the crossovers, but also the differences. That in each time that we can call rap into question for its misogyny, we can also find spaces where something else is being articulated. And that each time where the black church attempts to speak with some sense of legitimacy and authority, we can actually find spaces where the black church falters. And I guess my reading of Du Bois, over 100 years later, is that in that study, what he does is, the chapter is really a recounting of the various denominations among African Americans in Philadelphia and what kinds of services they offer to their communities and so forth. But interspersed in that recounting, there are all of these, what I read is very interesting hesitations around both the desire for the production of leadership, but also a worry that that leadership will come out of the church. And then by the time we get to the 50s and the 60s, the black church in the US context and elsewhere in other global spaces does emerge as this legitimate organization. But it's because there was nothing else for people to turn to. It was, in fact, the only site. So by 2005, 2006, when we see, a left-leaning mayor in Toronto meeting with Eugene Rivers and turn into so-called faith-based alliance as, quote-unquote, a new political move for addressing these issues, there's there are a whole set of questions that open up, and I can't solve them, and I won't even attempt to solve them, but it seems to me that they raise more questions and contradictions. One of the outcomes of the $3 million that was given to the GTA Faith Alliance this past summer to run social programs was that they actually ended up a set of infighting. So the money wasn't spent this past summer. It's now been. And so they're a set of meanwhile, organizations that had in previous years actually ran very successful programs for youth had to wait until the last minute to get the small pockets of money to mount those programs again. So they're very interesting kinds of things coming together that, in a sense, point to many of the kind of overlapping and contradictory moments of how neoliberal policies have actually played themselves out. And it's interesting that, in a sense, faith-based alliances make more sense in the context of neoliberal policies around governing and conducting oneself, and therefore being responsible for oneself as an individual, as opposed to non-governmental organizations who might still speak in a language of collective good.
I think I have a time frame question, because one of the most compelling parts of your argument for me is something about the 30-year range, especially as it has to do with the mugging crisis and policing the crisis in Stuart Hall. Because definitely one of the consequences of that, even if it's a bit delayed, is the introduction of something like ASBOs in the UK, the antisocial behavior orders, which end up being a very direct consequence of something that happened 30 years earlier. And it is very much the way that the new Labour government criminalizes young British men, especially young black British men. Probably one of the real surprises of the ASBOs, though, is that they've been giving them out quite frequently to young women as well. And there's a whole hysteria in the UK about youth female crime. And I was wondering if that jumps the Atlantic too, whether there is a criminalization of a feminine hip-hop style as well in Toronto, or is that something that hasn't quite landed yet?
No, it hasn't quite landed yet. But there's a strange, for lack of there's a strange kind of phenomena about what's happening in the UK around youth and the language of delinquency and deviance that I think is in some ways exceptional. I think it's in some ways different. But what I would say, what is crossing the Atlantic back and forth is the language of security. And that language of security is working itself out both at the national and international levels, but also in very, very local terms. And I think that, it behoves us as humanists and social scientists to really constantly make those links between the ways in which the language of security and threat and danger has seeped from the national and international into very, very local contexts, so that issues and concerns that we might have thought of differently at other points in time and come to different kinds of approaches with are all being actually seen within the same rubric, and the same kinds of approaches are being applied to them. So there's that sense in which all of the various kinds of violences of our lives are now being lined up as, in effect, the same thing.
This is kind of a slightly tangential, but I know you mentioned the example of France and the French riots, and I know that one explanation for that has been that they were socioeconomically based and that they've been mislabeled as kind of this uprising of the diaspora groups. What do you think are some of the dangers of reading kind of like an ethnocentric perspective into those kinds of events? Do they kind of oversimplify more complex issues, or I know you spoke of using more openly ethnic language in discussing politics, but I guess that's a fairly obvious question. But
no, it's not. Yeah, it's a good question. Part of what I would say are the correspondences between what happens in Britain around the language of the fear of the threat of the second generation bomber. What's happened in France, where those kids are also second and third generation. They haven't migrated from anywhere. They were born, they grew up there. And the fact that people talk about them continuously as though they're not French. And the same thing within the Canadian context, that these young people, by and large, are young people who are second and third generation Canadians. They haven't migrated from anywhere. So their subjectivities, their sense of self has been produced in these particular spaces. But what cuts across the spaces is that these communities continue to read themselves and to be read through a language of migration. So that's why I use this notion of migrant subjectivity, which is that even though they haven't been migrated, the language, the practice, whether it's at home within the private realm where parents are always kind of producing a romanticized nostalgia back home, or whether it's out in the public sphere where they're always being read as not citizen or not citizen enough, the language and persistence of migration begins to frame how they themselves come to understand themselves, so that they themselves would take up the language of migration. They themselves would sometimes take up the language of not belonging as a way of making sense of how they engage with the world. And so that's where I see these things cutting across national boundaries. When I talk about this notion of ethnopoliticality, part of what I'm trying to get at is that an ethnopoliticality, in my view, would ask us to recognize when ethnicity is being put into place and being worked on. It doesn't mean that we have to hold on to it as the only way of knowing, but it means that we need also to be able to respond on the terms of, or to engage the terms of how notions of ethnicity are being put into play. That we can't simply say, well, let's say, for lack of better language now, the right is using the language of ethnicity to criminalize South Asian men or to criminalize black youth. So we're going to try to use a response that doesn't highlight ethnicity. Is it in fact, I would argue that it is in fact, we have to struggle over the deployment of that term so that the right doesn't come to hold the final definition on what ethnicity means. So that's why I use the phrase ethnopoliticality, which is to always say that, the ethno is not tied to a particular kind of politics already that we know in advance, but the ethno is tied to a politicality that we have to work out in the midst of the struggle. So the ethno is not stationary, it's not static. It's what we're going to be working out in the moment of political struggle and articulation.
Have you noted, is there any sort of, or what is the political evolution of the dialogue, or the types of dialogue that are taking place in rap and hip-hop in context of maybe earlier forms from the 20th century, swing and jazz and rhythm and blues and soul and so forth? Can you speak to that?
I mean, there's been a long.
Repeat the question a bit. I'm not sure if it was heard.
Oh, I'm asked what are the, correct me if I go, what are the kind of relationships and dialogues between swing and jazz and soul and other kinds of earlier black musics and rap and hip hop culture. There's a lot of work in black popular culture music studies that tries to address exactly that conversation. The title of my paper is actually partly adapted from Mark Anthony Neal's book, What the Music Said, which is a study of soul and of soul music and then the emergence of rap. The last part of the book looks at the emergence of rap, or The Death of Rhythm and Blues. What's his name's book, The Death of Rhythm and Blues? Come back to me in a second. But there are two things about that. One is that a lot of that work has really extended itself to try to make links. And some of that work has argued for the break. Nelson George's book, The Death of Rhythm and Blues, argues for the break. That rap represents a new kind of break. I think that if there's one thing that, just like jazz and swing had moments where it spoke directly to its particular historical context, but it was also music that people wanted to have pleasure with, that soul does the same thing and rap music does the same thing. And this is in part the contradictions of these musics. So one always has to be careful not to only read these musics as embedded within some notion of social protest, because then you take away the pleasure, the fact that people just make music also for something called pure fun. But the thing about those musics, the one thing is, I would say, a continuing but also discontinuous narrative of resistance. So all of those musics at various points in time have within them a conversation about refusing the ongoing racial oppression of black people. And so rap music, with all of its contradictions, continually returns to, at various points, narratives about refusing various forms of racial oppression. I don't know if that's answering the question, but I think that is as much of the link as there is in some ways. That these musics come out of particular kinds of subaltern communities and then become commodified is another aspect of it. But generally, the sense of refusing music as one of the avenues through which people refuse racial oppression is one thing that binds them together.
My first question, not question, I have a couple, or a comments, or a couple comments. One of my first comments is, I'm happy, first of all, that you pointed out how the church isn't really a way to solve, the church or religion isn't necessarily going to solve the current issue in said Canadian inner city. If we go back far enough, Western religion was more or less used as subjugation for black people than it was as saving. You know, people brought in black people under the guise of church to subjugate them and turn them into slaves, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm happy that you pointed across the point that the church isn't going to be the savior of the current conditions of the minority of the black community that's disenfranchised. Also, Toronto, the city of Toronto, I think it's a city of its own. The whole situation with black people in Toronto I don't see that here. Either Toronto is more under the microscope, being the largest city in Canada, the largest amount of black people in a metropolitan area in Canada, all those situations. So I'm sure that there is a group of deviant black life in Toronto, but I don't think it's representative of the whole and the larger black population in Toronto or in Canada in and of itself. And that deviant black life isn't necessarily Canadian culture. It's more of a mirroring of the US culture. That video, I've never heard of it, but I've heard of a video that was made with a basketball player in the States in the video in another large US metropolis in the slums there. And it just seems to me that if anything, it's a bunch of scared youths trying to emulate a gang culture that is native to the United States and is not native to Canada. And I see it as a really poor reflection on black youth, because it's such a small minority, but it's under such scrutiny, so it's made out to be larger than it is, hence the whole moral panic, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just my comments on that.
I guess the one thing that I would say is that, these demographics in the Canadian situation shift and change. So here, the language of, in Winnipeg, the language of street gang crime is attached to Aboriginal First Nations bodies. And the policing mechanisms of the state work on those bodies in the way that they're working on black youth in Toronto and in the way that they work on South Asian youth in Vancouver. So in different spaces in the Canadian populace, they shift. So in Halifax, they work on black and Mi'kmaq native communities in similar kinds of ways, right? So the kind of question, I think that it used to be at one point legitimate to say that there's a kind of mimicking of something from the US context. But I don't think that argument holds anymore because of the quite serious conditions under which poor and working poor people are actually living in Canada. If we just take Canada as a kind of national state entity. I live around the corner from one of those neighborhoods, and if you look at housing, densely populated housing that was built in the 60s and 70s, where just the infrastructure at all has not been maintained, you can begin to see processes taking place that maybe 20 years ago we would say, oh, we can't really talk about ghettos in Canada in the way that we talk about them in the US context. And in some ways, obviously, they're still markedly different. But there are particular processes that are taking place that make these discourses and these realities actual in the Canadian context. So you go to Uniacke Square in Halifax, and you see these same kinds of processes at work. You go to various parts of the east side in Vancouver, you see them at work, and in this city. So.
I think we have time for one more question if there is one. If not, we will give Rinaldo a break. Hand it up.
I have a question, and when you were talking about the Boxing Day shootings in Toronto, and I, had the image of the kind of martyred vision of a young white woman who was shot, it reminded me of the Dawson College shootings. And so I want to shift urban spaces to Montreal for a minute to get to your point about resuscitating the language of ethnicity. Because after the Dawson College shootings, Jan Wong wrote an article in the Globe pointing out that the three mass murders that have happened in Montreal at Dawson College, at Concordia University of Fabricant, and the Montreal Massacre, the shooters were racially marked men, right? And she got into a lot of trouble for pointing that out in the context of Quebec politics. But it seems to me that within public discourse, it's impolite to talk about ethnicity in any sense. And so I'm wondering what kinds of interventions you would want to call for to deal with that sense that it's just simply rude to talk about ethnicity. Should we just be rude?
I prefer the word insubordinate. But it was the only time that I actually read Jan Wang And I was actually almost about to say, she's actually said something that's useful, right? And then all of a sudden, in the next day, everyone is, she's crazy, and they're embarrassed that she's from Montreal, and she shouldn't be allowed the platform in the Globe and Mail to say, you don't get those kinds of responses to Margaret Wente's articles at all. Nobody says she shouldn't have that kind of platform. So it's really interesting, but it exactly points to why we need to have conversations about ethnicity, because it is being deployed in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of ways. And what Wang almost was trying to say is that maybe it is possible that if we could have a conversation about racism within the context of Quebec, we might be able to begin, not to make sense, but to begin to make sense of these three men. So it wasn't only, it seems to me, a refusal of ethnicity at that point. It was a refusal to even talk about ongoing forms of racism. And that's in part what I want to, in a sense, use this notion of ethnopoliticality to get us to return to. How do we talk about racism as continually present in the lives of racialized people? Not necessarily differently so from those who are middle class and those who have somehow accessed the languages and the institutions of multiculturalism in a particular kind of way. But how do we talk about what I still see as the old operations of racism in some ways, working on the racialized poor? How do we have that conversation? Because when you try to, exactly what happened to Wang seems to come to the fore, both in polite ways and not so polite ways. So, insubordination.